What if I told you a king once believed his body was made of glass and had iron rods sewn into his clothes to avoid shattering, or that an emperor declared war on the ocean and awarded medals for collecting seashells? One ruler drowned over 200 women in a single night just because of a rumor. Another spent his final breath choking on cream buns, 14 of them. This isn't fiction. These were real rulers, real crowns, real madness. They sat on golden thrones while their minds unraveled in velvet-draped silence. Some ruled empires, others ruled their dinner tables, their dreams, or their delusions, but they all had one thing in common. No one dared stop them. In this video, we uncover the darkest, most disturbing stories of monarchs whose unchecked power led them into obsession, insanity, and horror. But what happened at the very end is worse than you think. Stay with me, because the final story will leave you speechless. Power has always tested the limits of the human mind. When left unchecked, when wrapped in ceremony and worship, it doesn't just distort it, warps, contorts, and sometimes annihilates the person who holds it. Across history, there have been rulers whose transformations from sovereigns to walking catastrophes challenge our understanding of sanity, not through legend or folklore, but through documented accounts, pages of history that reek not only of incense and ink, but of rotting flesh, locked chambers, and the echoes of laughter that should never have been. In the damp halls of early modern England, one monarch's body became a testament to the decay of power itself. James I, renowned for intellect and literary patronage, walked through his court like a miasma in motion. Diplomats and courtiers didn't gather near him, they calculated wind direction, seeking always to remain upwind. Why? Because their king's belief that bathing weakened the body had led him to forego it almost entirely. His garments were not just clothes, they were living ecosystems of filth and infestation. In a place where silence meant survival, whispers still spread about lice that audibly rustled in his hair and fell from his scalp onto documents during council meetings. Foreign envoys gagged in private, some refused second audiences, yet none dared correct him. Who would tell a king he reeked? His mouth, a cave of rot and sugar decay, could empty a hole with a single word. The Venetian ambassador wrote home of breath, so foul it left even seasoned diplomats gasping. His teeth, once instruments of royal command, had blackened and rotted into a grotesque smile. And still, this wasn't the result of ignorance. James was educated, widely read, a man who could quote scripture and Seneca. But in his mind, hygiene was beneath royal dignity. Cleanliness was for peasants. The king's filth became an assertion of untouchability. And in a world where no one could tell him otherwise, this belief festered like the lice in his scalp. The walls of the palace absorbed the smell. The velvet and silk of royal robes clung to it like cursed relics. His courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths. Physicians, terrified of suggesting real treatment, recommended strong wines and scented waters perfume for a corpse still walking. Jamis rule wasn't merely marked by policy or politics, but by a slow, odoriferous collapse of the body in real time, made all the more tragic by its inevitability. His presence turned every throne room into a chamber of entrance. His condition wasn't just tolerated, it became law by default. His decay codified in the absence of dissent. On the other side of Europe, another monarch, Francis Charles VI, fell into a delusion so strange it reads like surreal fiction. He believed he was made of glass, not metaphorically. In his mind, he was literally fragile, crystalline, one jolt away from shattering into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't a passing episode. For over 3 decades, Charles refused to be touched, barely moved, and commissioned iron rods to be sewn into his clothing like skeletal scaffolding. Tailors became armorers. Council meetings became theater, each movement choreographed to avoid his imagined fracture. Servants surrounded him with cushions. Chairs were padded, holes cleared of hard surfaces. State matters paused, while the monarch stood motionless, petrified by the idea that a simple handshake could destroy him. The kingdom moved around its glass king, paralyzed by his stillness. Diplomacy became mime. Treaties were not handed over, but placed gently on tables. Documents weren't delivered, they were approached like sacred relics. France, already fragile from war and political division, watched its leadership disintegrate behind walls of imagined transparency. His condition didn't burn fast and bright. It was a slow erosion of governance. While France battled real enemies, Charles battled the sound of his own footsteps. His paranoia became palace architecture. No hard corners, no sudden movements. His body, once a symbol of French power, had become a metaphor for national stasis. And still, no one intervened. He wasn't punished or replaced. He ruled, shaped policy, made decisions because the machinery of monarchy had no gear for a mental breakdown. The king believed he was glass, so the kingdom believed it too. In the cold reaches of Scandinavia, another monarch turned his court into a surreal playground. Christian V of Denmark was crowned at 17. What followed wasn't governance, but chaos masquerading as rule. Violence came first. Random attacks on servants, guests, even foreign dignitaries. One moment, pleasantries the next, blood. But that was just the beginning. Christian became obsessed with the children's game of leapfrog, not in jest, not in memory of youth. He demanded ministers, ambassadors, and aged statesmen leap over one another across palace floors 4 hours. Refusal meant rage. Exhaustion wasn't accepted. The corridors of Danish power echoed with the strained breath of grown men, hopping like boys, watched by a monarch whose eyes held no recognition of absurdity. Dignity evaporated. Laws paused. The nation's affairs were subjected to the rhythm of a game. He appointed his dog to the council, a real dog, with a title, a salary, and the seat at the table. The animal barked during discussions of war and trade. Christian nodded in approval, claiming to understand its input. Ministers sat in silence, papers before them, while a pet panted beside their king. And when the dog passed, there was a national mourning period, a funeral, a procession, not satire, reality. Behind palace doors, darker things brewed. His behavior with food devolved into near animalism. He tore meat with bare hands, rejected utensils, sometimes eating garbage with delight. At times, he refused food altogether, convinced it was poisoned. Days later, he would consume until sickness overwhelmed him. The court adapted. Meals became performances. Tablecloths became shields. His sexual behavior shattered decorum. Exposure during ceremonies, masturbation during state functions, unsolicited advances to anyone and everyone. The court created elaborate maneuvers to shield guests' false walls, planned distractions, sudden musical interludes. But nothing worked consistently, because madness, once empowered, adapts faster than protocol. And still, he reigned, because the crown, in its unchallengeable majesty, had no provisions for replacement. The nation around him bled stability, alliances frayed, and while Denmark drifted, Christian's doctor, Johan Struensee, slowly assumed control, governing in the name of a man who couldn't distinguish a foreign minister from a game partner. In this theatre of decline, pattern emerges, bodies rotting while courtiers smile, delusions accommodated until they become doctrine, games treated as law, and always, always the silence of those beneath the throne, forced to breathe through their mouths, to jump, to nod, to watch as their sovereigns dissolve. This isn't eccentricity, it's the architecture of absolute power collapsing inward, one cracked mind at a time, and the descent only begins. Beyond the palaces of Europe, in the flickering shadows of gilded halls, another sovereign took his fantasies from childlike to catastrophic. Peter III of Russia reigned for mere months, yet his actions left a scar across the empire. He didn't govern, he played. While generals and ministers waited, he arranged wooden battalions into lines and formations, obsessing over tiny soldiers with the seriousness of a battlefield commander. These weren't idle pastimes, these were rehearsals for policies. The fates of real soldiers hung on the maneuvers of toy ones. Every day he orchestrated pageantry. Courtiers were cast as infantry, statesmen as cavalry, grown men, leaders of Europe's largest realm, forced to crawl, to salute, to die dramatically upon orders barked by a man whose eyes glistened with boyish glee. He held tribunals for rats, literal rats accused of desertion or cowardice. Witnesses were summoned, sentences handed down, tiny gallows erected. The spectacle was equal parts absurdity and horror. What happens when the commander-in-chief loses distinction between theater and war? Reality itself becomes a toy box. Foreign diplomats returned home with stories that stung like satire. The Emperor of Russia discussing treaties while moving wooden cannons across a velvet table. Ambassadors dodging questions about alliances, waiting until the horse miniatures were in the correct position. There was no script for these scenes, no precedent, just the slow, dawning realization that behind Russia's grandeur stood a man more invested in make-believe than real blood and borders. Peter's consort, Catherine, watched with tightening dread. She saw not only the humiliation, but the danger. When a nation's ruler can no longer distinguish amusement from command, the empire's stability unravels like thread. -1 month was all it took. 6 months before she, with cold calculation, swept him aside. But the damage had already pierced deeper than politics. It had reshaped perception. In the minds of foreign powers, Russia's might was no longer terrifying, it was laughable. And still the pattern pulsed beneath it all. Unchecked power meeting unfiltered mind. A boy emperor, a rat tribunal, a sandbox of disaster. The descent continues, and still the pattern pulsed beneath it all. Unchecked power meeting unfiltered mind. A boy emperor, a rat tribunal, a sandbox of disaster. The descent continues. Then came Farouk of Egypt, a man whose palace gleamed with imported silk, but whose impulses mirrored the shadows. Farouk didn't merely rule, he collected, hoarded, and consumed with a hunger that was never satisfied. He stole watches from diplomats, jewelry from guests, pens from ambassadors' pockets not out of need, but from an unstoppable compulsion to take, to claim, to possess. At state dinners, he moved like a magician of mischief. A guest would arrive wearing a brooch by dessert. It would be gone. Diplomats learned to keep their belongings hidden. But nothing was truly safe. Even Winston Churchill, one of the most commanding presences in global politics, would reportedly leave a meeting with his timepiece missing. Farouk's compulsion wasn't merely a quirk, it was a consuming force that blurred the lines between ownership and ego. His appetite didn't stop with objects. Red automobiles became an obsession so vivid that he banned anyone else in Egypt from owning one. Citizens who dared to possess a red vehicle faced criminal consequences. His personal fleet swelled to over 200, all painted in shades of crimson that had to match his exact demands. Mechanics repainted cars not once, but several times, until the hue pleased him. It was not indulgence, it was domination through pigment. Then there was his private library, a vast archive unlike any other in the world, not of knowledge or literature, but of explicit material from every corner of the globe, catalogued, indexed, maintained by a team of royal archivists. This hidden vault expanded until it occupied entire wings of the palace. Entire days passed with the king behind locked doors, absorbed in this collection, not statecraft, not nation building, but fixation, ritualized and repeated. And still, no one intervened. Power shielded him from questions. His indulgence reached its peak in feasts that pushed the bounds of human consumption. Tables buckled beneath roasted meats, sugared fruits, and golden pastries. Whole chickens devoured in pairs. Rounds of beef followed by towers of dessert. Meals that stretched 4 hours. Staff documented servings not in plates, but in dozens. He ate not with elegance, but with urgency, as if devouring might fill something inside that could never quite be full. Over time, his body mirrored his excess. Furniture was redesigned to carry his weight. Doorways adjusted. Protocols rewritten to accommodate the space he occupied. And beyond the velvet curtains of the palace, women lived in fear. His private quarters became an engine of selection and summoning. Hundreds of women, some brought willingly, others coerced, were kept for his personal gratification. Their days marked not by calendars, but by the anxiety of summons. Few knew when it would be their turn. Fewer still knew how to prepare. Royal physicians worried for his health, but said nothing. The air grew heavy with unspoken truths. This wasn't simple greed. It was a psyche completely unbound, impulses without leash, desires without delay. A man who could have anything, and therefore demanded everything, not for utility, not for joy, but for proof that the world bent only to his will. And while Egypt faced poverty, uncertainty, and political tension, their king remained encased in crimson cars and vanishing timepieces. Power had not just distorted Farouk, it had hollowed him, and through that hollow, the entire structure of monarchy cracked. When revolution finally came, it wasn't just about policy, it was about shame, indulgence, and a people exhausted from watching their future dissolve into theft and red lacquer. Farouk did not fall in a blaze of rebellion. He drifted out of power like a man slipping into sleep, unaware that the world had moved on. Yet the memory remained not of speeches or achievements, but of compulsive fingers and crimson obsessions. And still the chain of collapse continues. In the sun-drenched palaces of Aragon, another ruler demonstrated that even joy, when fused with power and excess, could become lethal. King Martin of Aragon, a monarch known not for cruelty or neglect, but for his love of mirth, laughter, and lavish feasts, left behind a legacy that ended not with rebellion, but with breathless, convulsive hilarity. The court had seen many indulgent rulers before, but none who would laugh themselves into the grave. It began during a banquet, not a state function, but a personal celebration. The king had returned from a hunt, exhilarated and ravenous. The dining room glowed with candlelight and the scent of game and wine. Dishes arrived in waves: roasted quail in honey glaze, ball wrapped in pastry, endless jugs of rich red wine. He ate with gusto. Conversation turned to stories. Then, one courtier, perhaps emboldened by drink, told a joke. The joke itself is lost to history, but its impact was immediate. Martin began to laugh. Deep, hearty laughter, the kind that rolls up from the belly and overtakes the body. Laughter that doesn't ask permission. But this wasn't a few moments of mirth. It didn't stop. It escalated. His face turned crimson. His breathing fractured into staccato gasps. His arms flailed. His body convulsed. At first, the court laughed with him. Then, as the seconds stretched into minutes, laughter turned to alarm. Servants rushed to his side. Physicians summoned. But there was nothing in their training for this. The king, powerful, respected, adored, was undone by joy so powerful it broke his body from the inside. The feast had filled his stomach to the brim. The laughter shook it violently. Together, they collided in catastrophe. His diaphragm seized. His heart began to flutter erratically. The pressure mounted from within, pressure created not by war or disease, but by meat pies and merriment. The laughter, uncontrolled and unceasing, became like a force of nature, something primal, a reminder that the body, no matter how royal, has limits, and that those limits, once crossed, care nothing for crowns. It was said that Martin died with a smile on his face, but the court remembered it differently. His eyes were wild at the end, his body locked in a grotesque spasm of amusement that had long since ceased to be funny. Those who were present struggled for years to laugh again. Some never did. What do you do when happiness becomes a weapon? When indulgence slips past gluttony and into fatal absurdity? Martin ruled kindly, but even kindness, unchecked by moderation, can spiral into ruin. His death wasn't caused by a tyrant's rage or a general's betrayal. It was caused by an invisible thread snapping, the thread that tethers joy to control. And with that, another chapter in the anatomy of collapse was written. One where velvet robes and golden goblets gave way to choking gasps and a room frozen by helplessness. One where a feast turned into an obituary. From the depths of laughter to the edges of delusion, the spiral continues. In Rome, during one of its most unstable stretches of imperial authority, a young emperor would rise who turned the throne of the Caesars into a stage for grotesque performance. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, remembered by history as Caligula, became the embodiment of power unmoored from reality. His reign, brief and bloody, didn't simply cross lines, it erased them. It blurred divinity with delusion, leadership with lunacy, and transformed the most feared empire of the ancient world into a surreal pantomime. At the center of his madness was a horse, Incitatus, not merely a beloved animal, but a symbol and echo chamber of absurdity that amplified his descent. Caligula didn't just pamper the horse, he deified it. The stallion slept in a marble stable, dined from an ivory manger, and wore a collar encrusted with jewels. Entire villas were dedicated to the creature's comfort. But what startled Rome most wasn't the luxury. It was the emperor's serious plan to make Incitatus a consul, a high-ranking official of the state. Caligula spoke to the horse about foreign policy. He claimed to understand its responses. Senators watched in stunned silence as their power was mocked not by rhetoric, but by whinnies. This wasn't satire, it was law. His proclamations, however bizarre, carried the weight of empire. He dressed as gods Jupiter, Mars, sometimes Venus, parading through temples built in his honor. Statues of deities were decapitated and their heads replaced with his own likeness. He didn't request worship, he demanded it. Entire regions were instructed to offer tribute not to Rome, but to him personally. Those who hesitated, even slightly, were marked for elimination. What happens when a man believes not that he is chosen by the gods, but that he is all of them? Caligula stood before crowds and argued with marble idols. He screamed at silent statues, accusing them of betrayal, of disobedience, and when they remained mute as statues tend to, he ordered them destroyed. Temples shattered, icons defaced. Rome's traditions, rooted in centuries of layered belief, were unspooled in months. He held public games where executions were performed not as punishment, but as spectacle. Entire audiences invited not to learn or reflect but to cheer. Victims were killed for entertainment, and sometimes randomly selected guests were dragged from the stands to be thrown to beasts simply to fill time between acts. The crowd didn't clap, they gasped, but they knew silence was safer than protest. One day he declared war on the sea. He ordered his soldiers to line the beach and attack the waves with swords and spears. When the ocean, unbothered, refused to retreat, Caligula claimed victory. Chests of seashells were collected as trophies. Medals were awarded, songs composed. The absurd had conquered the eternal. Behind these displays lay a deeper, more unsettling truth. Caligula wasn't merely mocking Rome, he believed in what he did. To him, the absurd was real. The lines between fantasy and governance no longer existed, and Rome, bound by loyalty and fear, followed him into that illusion. Senators who questioned him disappeared, generals bowed to the horse, and the people of the empire, the millions who lived beneath the banners of the eagle, had no choice but to watch. He lasted only 4 years, assassinated not by enemies, but by his own guards, not for politics, but for survival. Caligula wasn't just a bad emperor, he was a mirror, showing Rome what happens when a crown is placed on madness, and no one dares to look away. And so, the spiral of power tightens further, not with violence, but with laughter, not with rebellion, but with applause. One by one, the minds behind the thrones unravel, and with them, the empires they rule. But the descent was far from over. In the mountains and forests of Bavaria, a king built castles not for defense or ceremony, but to house his dreams. Ludwig I, crowned in 1864, turned away from the politics of state and embraced the world of myth. Not a myth grounded in tradition or culture, but one spun entirely from the pages of opera and fantasy. His kingdom was real, but his throne became the foundation of a fantasy so elaborate it replaced everything else. Ludwig's world began to shimmer with unreality the moment he stepped away from court. He withdrew to the mountains, surrounded himself with architects, and demanded that they build him a medieval paradise. The result was Neuschwanstein Castle, a towering silhouette of turrets and arches, built with modern engineering, but designed to exist only in legend. It was not a place to rule from, it was a shrine to illusion. Inside, every wall told a story not of Bavaria, but of mythical knights and divine kings. Murals of swans, stags, angels, and warriors filled halls where no council ever met. Rooms were acoustically tuned not for conversation, but for solitary opera, guests were rare, ministers were excluded. Servants became stage hands in a royal play with no audience. He held dinners for the dead, full courses, silverware, and service for monarchs long gone: Charlemagne, Louis Chief, and phantom kings of law. He toasted their memory as if they were present. He paused for their replies, and when the silence lingered, he filled it with his own voice, conversing back. Ludwig lived at night. The sun had no place in his kingdom of dreams. By darkness he rode through candlelit forests in medieval garb, dressed as Lohengrin or Siegfried, sometimes alone, sometimes with musicians, always enveloped in a fog of music and memory. He saw himself not as a sovereign of people, but as a hero of legend destined not to rule, but to fulfill. Richard Wagner's music became his scripture. He funded the composer's vast operatic ambitions, then blurred the line between music and life. Ludwig believed he was a character in Wagner's stories. His life, no longer linear, began to fold upon itself. He reenacted scenes from opera in the halls of his castles, designed sets, directed lighting, rehearsed dialogue. The state collapsed under the weight of it. Infrastructure crumbled while he commissioned golden harps. Railways were neglected while he planned yet another turret for a castle no one would ever live in. Ministers pleaded. Audiences were scheduled, then cancelled. The machinery of governments rusted in silence. His people whispered of madness, but said little aloud. After all, his delusions were beautiful. The castles, the costumes, the music, it was all magnificent. But the treasury emptied, Bavaria teetered, and still Ludwig built, dreamed, rehearsed. Finally, his ministers acted. He was declared unfit, removed, but not without mystery. Days later, his body was found in a lake. Beside him, his psychiatrist, both lifeless. No witnesses, no answers, just the stillness of water and the weight of unanswered questions. Some called it tragedy, others escape, but all agreed on one thing. Ludwig had stopped being a king long before that final night. He had become a phantom of his own invention, haunting castles that no longer needed a ruler. And so, the descent of the sovereign mind took yet another turn, one painted not in blood or fire, but in fantasy and moonlight. Shall we keep descending? Then we arrive at a palace lined, not with stained glass or marble, but with fur. Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire, known to his people as both ruler and mystery, surrounded himself in textures, but hid a darkness, so consuming it reshaped an empire. He was called Ibrahim, the Mada title, whispered with both fear and resignation. His early years were spent in confinement, as was custom for Ottoman princes, locked in the gilded isolation of the palace's inner quarters, denied freedom, interaction, or education. Ibrahim emerged into power not as a man of vision, but as a prisoner released into limitless command. Years of solitude had twisted his view of the world. Desire, once dormant, now demanded fulfillment, and in Ibrahim's court, desire had no boundaries. His obsession with physicality began innocuously with texture, comfort, and extravagance, but it quickly escalated. Furs were draped over walls, floors were padded with velvet, curtains replaced with silk so thick it muffled footsteps. He claimed that only the softest surfaces were suitable for his skin. The empire's wealth was redirected not toward roads, armies, or diplomacy, but toward satisfying the sensory needs of one man. Ministers waited on carpets soaked in perfume. Meetings were conducted in whisper-soft rooms where no one dared speak above a murmur. But the true terror of his reign resided in the harem. Ibrahim developed a fixation on weight, specifically the pursuit of women of extraordinary size. He dispatched agents throughout the empire with orders to find the heaviest women possible. Rewards were promised, entire provinces disrupted by the hunt. Women were brought to the palace not for companionship, but for comparison, weighed, measured, recorded. Their humanity lost to the mechanics of desire. His chambers became more than opulent, they became prisons. Hundreds of women, stripped of agency, waited in fear of a summons. The atmosphere within the harem was one of silence and tension. Those who were chosen endured not simply physical encounters, but the raw exercise of a man attempting to replace lost years with acts of control. One day, his paranoia reached a fever pitch. Convinced that women in the harem had betrayed him, he issued a command that chilled the bones of even his closest advisors. Over 200 concubines were taken, sewn into weighted sacks, and thrown into the Bosphorus. The river, silent and dark, bore witness to one of the most massive state-sanctioned executions in Ottoman history. Only one woman survived. She tore open the fabric underwater and escaped, later offering testimony so harrowing it reshaped diplomatic understanding of the Sultan. Her words became the only full account of the horrors within those perfumed halls. But Ibrahim did not stop there. His obsession extended beyond the palace. He demanded women be taken from markets, homes, streets, wherever his gaze lingered. The empire held its breath each time he left his chambers. The lines between desire, madness, and cruelty vanished entirely. Officials pleaded for change. Some resigned, others disappeared, and all the while, Ibrahim reclined against velvet, wrapped in imported pelts, convinced he ruled not just an empire, but reality itself. Eventually, the weight of it all, the expense, the terror, the collapse of reason was too much. The court, once complicit through silence, acted. They deposed him. Quietly, finally, he was removed, not with drama, but with the heavy sorrow of a nation that had waited too long. And so, yet another throne was stained not by war, but by the slow, choking excesses of absolute will. Shall we go further? We must, because somewhere deep in the ancient palaces of China, a man sat beneath gold-tiled ceilings and drank poison, believing it would grant him eternal life. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, did not set out to lose his mind. He set out to conquer death, and in doing so, marched directly into its arms. His obsession began not as madness, but as fear. Fear of assassination, fear of fate, fear of being forgotten. Having unified warring kingdoms into a single empire, he turned his gaze inward, not to his people, but to his own mortality. He believed in eternal rule, not metaphorically. He wanted literal immortality. He summoned alchemists, mystics, doctors, anyone who might offer a path beyond death, and one by one, they promised him elixirs, potions, rituals. Most offered him mercury, disguised as medicine, drops at first, then vials, then daily doses. He drank liquid metal with the same confidence he signed imperial decrees. The irony was unbearable. The very substance he consumed to extend his life was destroying him from within. Mercury tremors invaded his hands. His moods grew erratic, speech slurred, vision blurred. Yet he believed. Each worsening symptom became proof that the potion was working, that the poison was purging weakness. And he built tombs beneath mountains, armies forged from clay. Tens of thousands of workers, many of whom would never return home, carved a terracotta army meant to protect him in the next world. Rows upon rows of soldiers, horses, weapons, locked in place underground, not as tribute, but as preparation. Qin Shi Huang planned not for legacy, but for command after death. He changed palaces nightly to confuse assassins, traveled in caravans of decoys, executed anyone who mentioned omens or dreams. His world grew smaller, quieter, more paranoid with each year. Reality narrowed to a corridor lined with shadows and filled with whispers. And then, during a journey to the eastern provinces, he died. Quietly, suddenly. So unexpected was his passing that officials hid it for weeks. They loaded his body into a carriage, surrounded it with crates of rotting fish to mask the smell, and continued the imperial tour, announcing that the emperor was merely ill. An emperor who tried to live forever had passed into myth in the most human way imaginable, afraid, alone, and poisoned by his own hand. But his story did not end with his body. For centuries, the tomb he built for himself remained sealed. Its traps, its mercury rivers, its deadly chambers, everything constructed to ensure his protection in the afterlife, became his prison in death. The great ruler who tried to outlast time remains entombed beneath a mountain of his own design. And so the spiral deepens. Immortality, indulgence, Isolation. Again and again, the stories return to the same truth. When power answers to no one, the mind behind the crown begins to drift, and what it builds, palaces, armies, tombs, horrors, is merely a reflection of the madness within. Shall we continue? Then let us follow the scent of roasted meats and sweet cream into the dining halls of Sweden, where a monarch's final performance was not on a battlefield or at a council table, but at a feast, one so excessive, so grotesquely unrestrained, that it tore through the very fabric of his body. Adolf Frederick of Sweden, sovereign of a nation known for order and stoicism, became known for one thing above all: the meal that ended him. It began as a celebration, as many royal excesses do. Shrove Tuesday, a pre-Lenten feast, an evening of indulgence before the austerity of fasting. But the king, already a lover of rich foods and lavish spreads, approached the table with more than appetite. He brought obsession. The menu was nothing short of gluttonous: lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, herring, champagne. The courses rolled in like waves, each heavier than the last. And then came dessert: similar soft wheat buns filled with almond paste and cream, soaked in warm milk. Not one, not 5, 14. Each semler swelled in his stomach like rising dough. By the time he leaned back in his chair, breath short and face pale, his body was fighting to survive the celebration. It could not. Within hours, he was gone, not with a cry, but a gurgle. A man unmade by sugar and pride. The court went silent, not with grief but with shame. For how do you mourn a monarch whose final act was unchecked gluttony? How do you eulogize a ruler who burst from within? Adolf Frederick's reign was not marked by conquest or policy, but by consumption. It wasn't that he enjoyed good food most monarchs did. It was that he never knew when to stop. That absence of restraint became the symbol of his rule. A man who mistook indulgence for identity. A king who ate until his title meant nothing at all. And yet, the story endured. For decades, across Europe, whispers of the king who feasted himself away rippled through royal courts. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale, a jest told between bites of dessert. But beneath the laughter was a deeper truth, that power without balance, pleasure without pause, becomes a weapon turned inward. And sometimes, the greatest threats to a kingdom come not from beyond its borders, but from within the banquet halls of its own palace. Then we reach a monarch whose final years brought together every thread in this tapestry of decay: physical collapse, moral corrosion, and the disintegration of self beneath layers of velvet and disease. Henry VIII of England, once hailed as a Renaissance figure, a scholar, musician, and warrior, ended not as a king, but as a rotting mass of indulgence and pain. By the end of his reign, Henry had become immobile. His weight surpassed 400 pounds. He could no longer walk without mechanical assistance or human support. Palaces were remodeled not for elegance, but for accommodation. Ramps were installed, furniture reinforced, servants trained not in etiquette, but in how to lift, maneuver, and dress their monarch. His leg, once the pillar of a jousting champion, had become an open wound, an ulcerated sore that festered and wept, filling his chambers with a stench so overpowering that even seasoned courtiers struggled to remain upright in his presence. No physician dared propose aggressive treatment. No servant dared wrinkle a nose. The wound, like the king's will, was untouchable. What was once majesty had become decay. His garments, rarely changed, stained with wine, grease, and bodily fluids, became tapestries of decline. Meals remained grand, but digestion no longer kept pace. His body bloated with excess. His breath carried the scent of infection. He had, in essence, become a walking mausoleum. But physical degeneration was only the surface. Inside, Henry's mind turned cruel, not with the whimsy of madness, but with the precision of paranoia. Friends became traitors, wives became enemies. He signed execution orders with the same hand he once used to compose love songs. He removed those closest to him not in rage, but in cold calculation. And Bullen, Thomas More, Catherine Howard, one by one, trust collapsed. His court, once alive with debate and poetry, grew silent. Ministers no longer offered counsel, they offered echoes. Truth was filtered through fear. Decisions made not by policy, but by whatever mood governed the swollen man on the throne. And yet, even in this state, Henry demanded admiration, desired desire. His pursuit of affection continued even as his body repelled it. He sought intimacy, while his leg oozed beneath silk, and his breath curdled wine. What had once been romantic ambition was now grotesque longing. By the time he died, his body was already beginning to disintegrate. During transport to the tomb, his coffin burst. The pressure of decomposition too much for the wood and metal. Fluids leaked onto the church floor. Dogs followed the trail. And still, no one spoke ill, because the structure of monarchy demanded reverence even for a man who had outlived his own humanity. Henry VIII didn't vanish in madness. He decayed in full view, a monument to what happens when willpower overrides wisdom, when indulgence replaces introspection, and when the body of a king becomes a symbol for the rot within his kingdom. And so we end, not with fury or fire, but with silence. A silence heavy with the knowledge that every story you've heard here, every descent into obsession, delusion, or ruin was allowed, enabled, encouraged, because when no one can say no, history doesn't bend, it breaks. Henry VIII didn't vanish in madness. He decayed in full view, a monument to what happens when willpower overrides wisdom, when indulgence replaces introspection, and when the body of a king becomes a symbol for the rot within his kingdom. And so we end, not with fury or fire, but with silence. A silence heavy with the knowledge that every story you've heard here, every descent into obsession, delusion, or ruin was allowed, enabled, encouraged, because when no one can say no, history doesn't bend, it breaks. This is the true terror of unchecked power. It doesn't always arrive with trumpets or tyranny. Sometimes it enters quietly, clothed in silk, wrapped in rituals, praised in poems, and once it's seated, it begins to hollow the mind that wears the crown, slowly, systematically, until the sovereign is no longer a person, but a performance, a grotesque theater playing endlessly, until the curtain finally drops. You've traveled now through palaces soaked in perfume and madness, through dining halls of deadly laughter, through chambers of glass, velvet, marble, and bone. You've seen kings turn into children, emperors into ghosts, rulers into relics of their own obsessions. And every step of that journey reveals the same truth. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it isolates. It dissolves boundaries. It erodes reality. And still, in every case, it wasn't the madness alone that destroyed them. It was the silence around it, the absence of challenge, the fear of dissent. Because when a throne is raised high enough, no one dares speak upwards. This isn't just a story of monarchs long gone. It's a warning whispered through history's locked doors. Whenever a voice becomes unchallengeable, whether draped in velvet or glowing from a screen, the spiral begins again. Power seeks echo, not opposition, and minds, even the strongest, begin to bend beneath its weight. So listen carefully, not just to the stories of the past, but to the tone of the present, because in some corner of the world, even now, another palace may already be preparing its curtains, and somewhere behind them, a crown waits for the next mind to wear it.